Welcome back. As always, it is your friend Arachnid Soul coming to you today with something a little bit different. We're going to talk a little bit about what I did for my WrestleMania 38 weekend. Before we get into that, please do me a favor, hit that thumbs up and subscribe. As many of you may or may not know, I have not watched any WWE in a number of years, over 15 years at this point. But it's WrestleMania, and usually what WrestleMania means to me is me seeing something online about it being WrestleMania and me not watching. This was the year that they finally got to me. If you haven't noticed, this is a super chill video. We're going to be laid back. We don't exactly know how we're getting there, but I have some clue as to where we're going. And kick back, close your eyes, nothing to really see on screen, and we're just going to reminisce about some great pro wrestling, if you will. This was the year that a Peacock ad popped up and it said NBC Universal Peacock Streaming had a WrestleMania deal going on. You could get 12 months for only $3.80 US a month. I said, okay, I'm going to sign up. But I didn't sign up with the intent to watch WrestleMania. I wanted to go back. I wanted to see my boys. I wanted to see my boy Dean Malenko. I wanted to see my boy Kurt Hennig. I want to see my boy, the greatest of all time, Bret Hitman Hart, and the full libraries were there. I've not seen many of these matches, many of these events in decades. Some of them I had never seen. So to me, what WrestleMania weekend became was I had a little bit of weed here. I wasn't going to watch WrestleMania, but I had the entire libraries of everything from Smoky Mountain Wrestling to ECW to Old World Class Championship Wrestling, Fritz Von Erich down in Dallas. And I sat there, and over the course of 2 days, WrestleMania is now 2 days long, I watched probably Saturday, started out a little bit slow, watched about 4 hours, nothing too serious, just random stuff, and I'll get into what that was in a second. Sunday was the big day. Sunday is WrestleMania Night 2. And I got up Sunday morning, and at about 6 o'clock in the morning, I started watching wrestling. I watched wrestling, I'm going to say, until Sunday night, probably around 11 p.m. I mean, I put in my time. I put in some good time, 13, 14, 15, 16 hours, whatever you want to do. I had to check in, like I said to you before, with my favorite wrestler of all time. A wrestler I don't talk a lot about because I can't really describe to you how good this guy was at everything, how he was the best. I just mentioned him, Bret Hart, the excellence of execution. Growing up, I lived and died with Bret Hart matches. That was my dude. I was with Bret, I was with Davey Boy, I was with Owen, his whole family, and then there was some guy from San Antonio, and we're not even really going to mention him in this video. He might come up. I had never seen in my life the match that Scott Hall, a.k.a. Razor Ramon, had with Bret Hart for Bret Hart's World Wrestling Federation World Heavyweight Championship back in 1993 at the WWF Royal Rumble. This was kind of before my time, and also I've never been a big fan of the Royal Rumble matches, so I can see why I wouldn't have seen this. I didn't have the Blu-ray. I didn't have any of the things to watch this video. I went back and watched it. If you have not seen this match, if you want to see what American pro wrestling is, to me, what it should be, go back and watch this match. Scott Hall, Razor Ramon having, in my opinion, the best match of his career. I don't know if it's said a lot, but for all the shit that Shawn Michaels and the rest of the people in the clique give Bret Hart had the best match that Scott Hall ever had was with Bret Hart. The best match that Shawn Michaels ever had, in my opinion, the greatest pro wrestling match I've probably ever seen. Certainly the greatest pro wrestling match I've ever seen in WWF, WWE, which was the WrestleMania 12 main event. Bret Hart, the world champion, versus Shawn Michaels, the boyhood dream. That was the best match Shawn Michaels ever had in that company. All of his matches were great, but Bret took him to the best match. Let's talk about Bret versus the 1-2-3 Kid. That was the best match that the 1-2-3 Kid, another Clique member, ever had in that company. Let's talk about Bret versus Big Daddy Cool Diesel Kevin Nash. the best match that Kevin Nash ever had in that company. And that's true of basically anyone who wrestled Bret Hart. Most guys that wrestled Bret Hart, one of the matches that they had against Bret Hart, the best match they've ever had. In my opinion, the best matches that Bret Hart has ever had were with all these people, but the best matches that Stone Cold Steve Austin ever had were against Bret Hart. And you talk about WrestleMania 13, you talk about that I Quit match. Look for a match online that they had, Bret Hart versus Stone Cold Steve Austin. It took place in South Africa sometime in late 1996. I had not seen this match until probably about 3 months ago. It's the best match I've ever seen Stone Cold Steve Austin in. In my opinion, it tops everything that they did on pay-per-view. And also, it's one of the best showings of Bret Hart. Bret Hart coming off the top rope. Bret Hart doing all sorts of stuff and nailing everything perfectly. I think it's something like the Sun City Super Bowl. You can find it. It took place in South Africa. I know it's on YouTube. Look for it. You will love it. Crowd's great. Commentary team is Jim Ross and Owen Hart. And Owen's on color, so you know it's going to be good. Anyway, I sat there, I watched Bret and a Razor, top to bottom, a masterpiece. Bret Hart, so good in the ring all the time, the crowd's with him. I love a guy who ignores the hard cam. I love a guy who puts his head down and goes to work. I love a guy whose number one and number two goals, and this switches from prize fighter to prize fighter. I want to make the most money I can, and I want to have the best matches I can to do the best I can for the promoter, which means I'm going to get more opportunities for more money. Bret Hart and Scott Hall never lost sight of that. Scott Hall, Razor Ramon, was so hungry. This was the biggest match of his career, and from the time he walked through the curtain, absolutely nailed it. I talked to someone maybe a year ago, and I was talking to them about who were the coolest guys ever in pro wrestling. Bret's on that list. Scott Hall's on that list. Dusty's on that list. We're going to do it one more time right now, if you will. So to have two of the coolest in the ring, absolutely insane. I also sat down and watched one of my favorite pro wrestling pay-per-views of all time, WCW NWO Super Brawl, easy for me to say, easy for me and Lex Luger to say, 1998. And you're thinking, well, what happened on that card? This was the breakout night for Booker T. This is that night when Booker T took on both the model Rick Martel as well as Perry Saturn. The first half hour of this pay-per-view is Booker T in a singles match versus one and then versus the other. This was for the TV championship. This was the match that launched Booker T. In my opinion, he was a great tag team wrestler. He had been a great singles wrestler for a little run then, but this one really put him on the map. This and the Best of 7 series that he had with Chris Benoit, who I also watched later on. And actually, before I forget, let me mention that match. I have a piece of paper here. I jotted down some things. I wanted to go back and watch some of the best matches that I had ever seen and some of the best WWE matches I had ever seen. So I had to go back to Royal Rumble, I believe it is 2003. Chris Benoit versus Kurt Angle. You had Charlie Haas, you had Shelton Benjamin, the Team Angle members barred from ringside. These two put on a clinic. If you remember, that was the night that Chris Benoit really elevated himself, and after they'd cut away from the match, they cut back, and it's Benoit standing in the ring by himself. Kurt's gone, and it's a standing ovation from the crowd. And you can almost see Chris Benoit start to tear up. One of the defining moments of that man's career. Chris Benoit, probably my second favorite wrestler of all time, right behind Bret Hart. Well, everybody's far behind Bret Hart, but to be number 2 isn't bad. WCW Super Brawl 98. We talked about Booker T. Let's talk a little bit about the Canadian Crippler, a little bit more. He had that great United States Heavyweight Championship match against Diamond Dallas Page. People will talk about DDP, and people will talk about him and Goldberg at Halloween Havoc and how that's DDP's best match. DDP had great matches against Eddie Guerrero, against Bret Hart, against Randy Savage, and arguably had the best match of his career here. Everything was so on point. Against Chris Benoit, just the whole match. If you can find it, Benoit versus Page, Super Brawl 98. Go back and watch it. It holds up. All of this stuff holds up. That was also the night that we saw the Outsiders again, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, take on the Steiner brothers. And that was the night that we saw the birth of Big Papa Pump Scott Steiner. There's been a lot of DVDs and a lot of talk and a lot of hyperbole about how WCW didn't know how to build stars. Well, you know, the victor tells the story, and WWE is the victor, so that's the story that we hear. This is one pay-per-view, Super Brawl 98. We saw the launch of Booker T, a man who would become world champion. We saw the launch of Chris Benoit, a man who would become world champion. We saw the launch of Diamond Dallas Page. We saw the launch of so many of these people who would go on to become world champion. So, really not a great argument. But anyway, that's one of my favorite pay-per-views of all time. We can then continue, because to me, when we're talking about WrestleMania and we're talking about watching some of the greatest of all time, I hate to say it, I probably watched 6 or 7 Bret Hart matches in one day. Had to watch Bret and Lawler again. It was Bret and Lawler, and these were, you know, you would always see clips growing up. You always knew that there was some issues between those two guys, but you have to go back and review the history. And I'm seeing Jerry the King Lawler just verbally eviscerating Stu Hart, Bret Hart's father, and Helen, Bret's mother, and the audience in the build-up to this match. I believe it was SummerSlam. I don't quite know the year. I watched so much stuff and skipped around. Sometimes I would just watch one match. Sometimes I would sit there and watch the entire pay-per-view. This was the match where Bret Hart fought Doink the Clown and then fought Jerry the King Lawler right after this. And Lawler uses a crutch and hits Bret Hart in the face as hard as you could possibly hit another human being. I mean, New Jack, out of jealousy, was rolling over in his grave and almost sliced Bret Hart's whole face open. He hit him from behind, so the cane kind of wrapped around and broke off in Bret's face. And I mean, I don't know if it hit Bret in the eye or, I mean, it was just absolutely brutal. And that's how the match started, because Bret went from wrestling Doink to wrestling Lawler. Bret gets up. Folks, I'm a Bret Hart fan. I don't know if I've said that in this video. There's a couple of times where Bret Hart goes to that next level, where Bret Hart steps it up, where you can tell Bret Hart's a little bit more pissed off. It's Bret and Shawn in that final match they had at Survivor Series 97, when Bret's throwing those, some of the most brutal, most beautiful punches I've ever seen a pro wrestler throw, and just drilling Shawn Michaels. He was using those same punches against Lawler because he's pissed off that Lawler hit him in the face with that crutch. Now, at the end of the match, Bret Hart locks on that sharpshooter, that Sator Gatami, that Scorpion Deathlock. Let's do it one more time, Dusty, if you will. And Lawler taps out. And Bret has this sharpshooter. I like to think I've seen some sharpshooters. This might be the nastiest sharpshooter that any pro wrestler has ever used in a wrestling match, and he keeps Lawler locked in that thing for about 3 minutes. The officials run down. They're trying to break it. Bret is pissed off that Lawler hit him in the face with that crutch, and Bret is cranking back and sitting back on this thing, and Lawler is screaming. That might have been some of the most agonizing stuff Jerry Lawler ever went through in his career. And Lawler, I mean, he crawls back. It's well documented. He was in the back. He could not stand up. They'd put ice packs on him. It was a whole thing. He was kind of damaged for a while after that. But let's continue. Then I found out that Ring of Honor is kind of back under some new ownership. We won't talk about that too specifically, but it's Supercard of Honor. And it's also one of my favorite wrestling companies going back the past 20 years. I mean, I've been a massive fan of TNA, now Impact Wrestling, which I no longer watch. There's a whole video on that. In fact, The description's down below if you want to check that out. And I said, what is this going to be? What is this new era of Ring of Honor? Is it still Ring of Honor, or is it going to be some of the, well, let's not mention that wrestling group, but it was Ring of Honor. It was great wrestling. I mean, my girl Mercedes Martinez, who I remember watching early on, like 2004, when it was like her and Lacey and Daisy Hayes and Mischief and all those, Allison Danger, all of those women that were coming up on the independent circuit who set the table for what WWE likes to take credit for, the women's revolution that actually started in places like Shimmer and places like Ring of Honor and places like TNA. TNA probably did more for women's wrestling to kick things off with that Knockouts division that started, I believe, October of 2007 at Bound for Glory than any other company, but somehow Stephanie McMahon takes credit for it. Anyway, Mercedes Martinez versus Willow. And I have to tell you, I watched so much wrestling that I have not finished watching this pay-per-view yet. So far, it's brilliant. We got to see my boy, Jonathan Gresham, open up the card with an interview. Maybe my favorite pro wrestler going right now and has been over the past 2 years. I love the way that he respects the business. I love the way that he handles himself. I love the way that he respects the sport, more to the point. And it's nice to see in an era where so many people don't even understand what they're supposed to be doing and what their goals should be. We're going to see what happens with Ring of Honor. We're going to see how things go. Hopefully it goes well. Hopefully they carry on more in that direction. But let's also talk about the fact that WrestleMania this day, when I sat down and just watched wrestling, I also caught up with some world-class championship wrestling, the 1980s. We're talking about David Von Erich. We're talking about Kerry Von Erich. We're talking about Fritz. Are we talking about Michael Von Erich? No, but we're certainly talking about my favorite Von Erich, Kevin Von Erich, and the great Kabuki, and Super Sock Jose Lothario, and so many of the greats. Keith Mitchell already doing a great job with the production of the video and the audio. Keith Mitchell and Fritz Von Erich were two guys who basically said, we're going to make sports much more, not high definition, but much more clear, the audio much better. And it was world-class championship wrestling that not only changed the production quality of all other pro wrestling after that point, but also all other sports. I mean, you go back and watch football or basketball or baseball or hockey or tennis or golf or rugby, if you can find any of that, before world-class championship wrestling, and the camera tends to be a little bit farther away, and the audio's not great, and it's kind of blurry. You know those old NFL films, you watch them and they're from 67, but they look like they're from 1867? Bam Bam Bigelow took on the big boss man, Ray Traylor. Two great big men, and I watched so much wrestling. This must have been on something else that I saw where Bret Hart did something, but I couldn't tell you which event this was on. The crowd was really behind the big boss man, which was interesting because I guess it was more the hatred that they had for Bam Bam Bigelow, but two guys who were just great in the ring. For two guys to be that big and both be that agile and both have that level of cardiovascular conditioning is absolutely insane. But a great match that they had. If we're talking about wrestling, we have to talk about Rick and Scott Steiner, the Steiner brothers, one of the greatest tag teams of all time. They were just inducted, as a matter of fact, last weekend into the WWE's version of the Hall of Fame. I didn't see that, but I'm happy for them. I watched them both take on the Heavenly Bodies. I don't know if maybe that was at a SummerSlam but great match. It was nice to see the Steiner brothers in WWE using the ropes. All of their stuff just looked brutal. The Steiner lines, the suplexes. I mean, I've told people this before. You watch those Steiner brothers matches, they're throwing people and they're not even looking to see how the person's going to land. By the time the guy hits, Scotty's already on his knees, front double bicep, standing over his brother, Dogface Gremlin. They had a great match against the Heavenly Bodies. And then I also watched them versus Luger and Sting. I believe that would have been Super Brawl 1. And the crowd was behind all four of those guys, which made it really interesting to see them compete against one another. Luger was still very new. Sting was still very new. These were interesting situations for them to be in where the crowd was not just behind them the way that they usually were. They were behind both teams. But really what I saw over this weekend was some great wrestling. And I also I watched ECW, part of it, Massacre on 34th Street. I remember watching that back in the day, and a lot of these things that I watched were things that I wanted to see or kind of heard of and didn't really get around to. I'm very happy to tell you that all of the Owen Hart stuff and all of the Chris Benoit stuff, people who WWE for different reasons have basically tried to erase in a lot of ways, it was all there. And if you're going to watch great pro wrestling, these are two go-to guys. I mean, Owen, one of the greatest of all time. And it's not said. And to think that two great talents like that came out of the same family. Yes, there were 12 brothers and sisters, and half of them were women, and some of them were wrestlers. But to get two that good out of the same family is absolutely insane. Two guys to be trained by their father in Stu Hart's dungeon. And then also Chris Benoit, and then Lance Storm and Chris Jericho. And speaking of Chris Jericho, where I really started this journey, watching all this stuff on WrestleMania weekend, was I just pulled up an old episode of WWF Monday Night Raw, and it happened to be an episode, and this is more vague to me than a lot of the other wrestling because I wasn't really watching Monday Night Raw as intently growing up as I was watching like NWA Anarchy and WCW and AAA and CMLL and New Japan and All Japan. But I'd go over to my friends' houses sometimes and I would watch what was going on WWF Monday Night Raw. This is years after Bret's gone. And this was that first night when Chris Jericho defeated Triple H, and then they reversed the decision, but it was for the World Championship, and the place went nuts. And I sat there and I kind of fast forwarded through a lot of the episode, but Chris Jericho, one of my favorite wrestlers as well growing up. I liked him basically until once he kind of became Y2J and kind of jumped over there, I wasn't really as into him, but I was still aware of how great he was in the ring. He's really holding his own against Triple H. In fact, I would say he's carrying Triple H in this match. Not that Triple H was horrible, but Jericho was next level. Another guy who came out of Stu Hart's dungeon. And I watched some of the old Royal Rumble, non-Royal Rumble matches. I watched some of the King of the Ring stuff, some of the SummerSlam stuff. I couldn't get to everything. Did I want to sit there and watch Bret beat everybody at King of the Ring? Absolutely. But there was so much other stuff, I just couldn't sit down and commit to any one thing. Greatest match that I've ever seen. Again, I've talked about this. You've heard me mention this. Bret and Shawn, the Iron Man match, WrestleMania 12. I'm saving that one. I'm saving it for a special occasion. I haven't seen that match in years and years and years. To me, when I think about pro wrestling, when I think about WWE, that's the match. That feeling, that emotion that I had. I remember being a little kid and my dad had to leave that night and I was home alone, and before he left I said, can you order this? Because even though I wasn't a pro wrestling fan really at that time, I knew Bret Hart from the video games and he was my favorite guy, and I saw the commercial and the 60-minute Iron match. They will go the hour, and just blown away by all the black and white clips and them talking about, will this be the end for the Hitman's legacy? So I remember sitting there and watching that by myself at home, no lights on, but the sun was still up. I was on the West Coast. And as that pay-per-view started and the lights went off and you saw the whole thing and it built and it built and it built, and it's Bret and Shawn, and that match started. It's the two best pro wrestlers of the past 50 years. It's the best two pro wrestlers you can find an insane amount of footage on, going at it for 1 hour and showing you what pro wrestling should be. If there was one match I was going to show someone to tell them this is what American pro wrestling should be, it would be Bret and Shawn. And that's basically how I spent my WrestleMania weekend. There was lots of other little stuff that I watched. I wanted to watch some of that great Smoky Mountain Wrestling from Jim Cornette, because every time I've seen that, I'm like, why can't we have this? Why isn't somebody with this type of mentality doing something to give us a wrestling league now? And so many people have never seen it, and I don't even know if they could appreciate the nuance and the subtlety and the brilliance and the experience behind it. But I was not able to watch any of that. There was also some other kind of indie stuff that they had on there that I would like to get to. But you know what? For $3.80, it was a tremendous WrestleMania. For anybody asking me what happened at WWE, WWF WrestleMania 38, I couldn't tell you. And I'm recording this Monday morning, so this is the night after the main event, big night of WrestleMania. I hardly know who wrestled on there. I couldn't tell you championships or who's doing what or whatever happened, but I can't imagine that it was any better than the stuff that I watched. Again, I wish I could have watched some more Mr. Perfect stuff. I did see so much stuff from Bobby the Brain Heenan, both in WCW and the old stuff in WWF with Gorilla Monsoon when he's on commentary. What a brilliant guy. I mean, and we just talked about Jim Cornette. When you talk about great pro wrestling managers, wouldn't it be nice to have a couple of guys running around in that same league who could manage and who could talk half as well right now as Bobby Heenan and Jim Cornette? Anyway, it has been your host, your friend, your mate, Arachnid Soul. I could talk about wrestling for the next 12 hours, and I'm probably going to go back and I'm going to watch some more stuff. If there's anything great that I watched that I did not mention, I apologize. I apologize to all of those wrestlers, dead or alive, and I apologize to you, but we'll come back. We'll talk more wrestling. Hopefully I've given you some stuff to go watch. That's the hope. If you have Peacock, go back, listen to my suggestions. Watch these matches. Watch Bret and Razor at the Royal Rumble. Watch Bret and Shawn at WrestleMania 12 in the Iron Man match. Watch Bret and Austin in South Africa at the Sun City Showdown, Sun City Super Bowl, whatever it is. Go back and watch. I hate to tell you, I didn't get to watch any Bret versus Owen stuff, and I know it's all 100% gold. Do me a favor, on the way out, give me a thumbs up. Let's have a conversation. I said a lot of stuff in this video. I know there's a lot of stuff you want to talk to me about. I want to talk to you about it. So thank you again for joining me. Hopefully you have subscribed and hit the bell and done all of that stuff. Should we do one more for Dusty on the way out? I think we'll do it at the end. And I will catch you, my friend, if you will, later.